Okay, I know everyone is very, very excited, but we still have a very important part of our program this evening. I do want to thank everyone. I want to thank everyone for their attention and for their participation. And I hope that you've had a chance to meet some exciting people at your tables. So thank you very much. My name is Javette Laramont. I'm the class of 1980. I'm honored to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, the renowned and trailblazing fashion designer, Diane von Furstenberg. Diane has been lauded throughout the fashion world as an artist extraordinaire and a businesswoman whose ultimate goal is to empower women in their everyday lives. She is a self-made woman who came to the United States from Europe with her designs and her ambition, which was necessary to build this most influential company that we see today. Her clothing and her accessories are sold in more than 55 countries around the world. And she's been honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Council of Fashion Designers of America, CFDA. As the long-standing president of the CFDA from 2006 through 2015, and now as the chairperson of the council, she has dedicated herself to fostering emerging talent and bringing artists with diverse perspectives into the fold. Over the years, Diane has applied her time and her energy to enhancing opportunities for women and strengthening a sense of community throughout New York City. She sits on the board of Vital Voices, a non-governmental organization that supports female leaders and entrepreneurs around the world. And she established the DVF Awards to honor and provide grants to women who have displayed leadership, strength, and courage in their commitment to their causes. And she's been very busy. She's been very active in the campaign to develop the historic High Line Railroad into the beautiful park that we all enjoy today in New York. She also serves on the boards of the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation, the Shed, the new Center for Artistic and Cultural Innovation in New York City. And she is the author of a memoir entitled The Woman I Wanted to Be. And she's been named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. But I think she probably would agree that her greatest achievement has been as a proud parent of two Brown graduates, Alexander, class of 1991, and Tatiana, class of 1992. So we are in the midst of royalty because she is a princess, and we are so excited to have us join us this evening. So please give her your undivided attention and join me in welcoming Diane von Furstenberg.
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So, yes, I think that one of the happiest moments of my life actually was when I was here at Brown when Vartan Gregorian became president. And there was a reception. And Vartan happens to be one of the people that I admire the most. And he made a speech, and I was sitting there in the audience between my son and my daughter, who were both students here. And my heart was full of gratitude to know that my children were in the hands of such an incredible man and such an incredible institution. So I'm very happy to be here. So usually I speak to very, very young women who are at the beginning of their lives. And then I was told a few days ago that this is not the case, that this is a room full of alumni, some of which are even older than me. So what I usually talk about is women and women's stories and lessons that I have learned from women and that I have learned from my life. So I will begin by taking you in May 1944. So that's 73 years ago in occupied Belgium. It was during the war wasn't over yet, and in occupied Belgium there was this 22-year-old young woman who got arrested, and she got shipped to concentration camps for slave laborers. She went to Auschwitz, then she went to Ravensbrück and yet another camp. She spent 13 months in the camps, and when she was released, she weighed 49 pounds. So 49 pounds is not very much, but she did survive, and she went back to Belgium, waited for her fiancé who was in Switzerland, and 6 months later she got married. And the doctor told the couple, it's fine that you get married, but watch it, you can absolutely not get pregnant. Because if you get pregnant, you won't make it and your child won't be normal. Well, 9 months later, I was born and I was not normal. My mother we all know that, because I'm sure that most of you had a strong mother. And when you have a strong mother, sometimes you fight it because she's so strong. But then one day she's no longer there, and then you realize how much you owe her and how much of her strength is part of you. I was born on New Year's Eve, so every New Year's Eve my mother used to write me a letter. And what she used to say was, God saved me so that I can give you life. And by giving you life, you gave me my life back. You are my torch of freedom. So the torch of freedom is what was put in my crib, and that's probably what really influenced me all my life. Freedom is the most important thing. So one of the lessons that my mother told me is that fear is not an option. So if I was afraid of the dark, she would lock me in the closet. So it's not very politically correct, and I'm sure she could get arrested today. But at the end of it, the truth is that I was not afraid of the dark, because after 5 minutes, the dark is no longer dark, and even if it is, there's no reason to get afraid of. So fear is not an option was her lesson. Then she also told me, I would tell you the biggest lesson she gave me. She also told me an incredible lesson that she said, when something bad happened to you, you should see that maybe it's really bad on the moment, but it may be the best thing that happened for you. And she explained to me that after 4 days, they were put in from Belgium, and they went all the way to Auschwitz. They were in cattle trains with no air, nothing, for 4 days. And in this cattle train, she became friendly with a woman who was older. She was 22, and that woman was in her early 40s. And that woman spoke a little German. So my mother decided, no matter what happens, I will never leave that woman. So they arrived, and 4 days later, and they got undressed, they shaved their hair, and all of that. And then there was this long, long line, and there was a soldier who would divide them. You go left, you go right, you go left, you go right. And behind this soldier who was doing that, on an elevated, almost like here, on an elevated platform, there was another man of a higher rank who was just looking and didn't move. So when time came for the friend of my mother, the soldier said, you go right. And my mother, without being told where to go, went right too. And the soldier let her go without saying anything. This other man got up to my mother, whipped her, and pulled her on the other side. And she looked at him with such hate, thinking, why? Why are you doing that? And she hated that man so much. Well, at the end, the truth is that that man actually saved her, because the people who went to the riot were going straight to the gas chamber. So it's a very dramatic story, but it's a story that I use always when some of my friends are depressed about something. I said, you know what? That may not be the worst thing that happened. And it always works. It puts everything in perspective. So another lesson that my mother told me is that we all the same, right? We eat, we sleep, we work, we fall in love, we make love, all do the same thing. But what makes us different is how we do it. And as an illustration of that, she would tell me, still we are in the camp, that everybody was equal, nobody had anything, everybody had nothing. And after 2 weeks, they were the leaders and the victims, the followers, the rich and the poor. A society would form very, very quickly. So that's another lesson. Whatever. But the biggest lesson that my mother always told me is no matter what, you can never be a victim. Don't ever show that you're a victim. And as an illustration of my mother saying that, after she died, I found 2 things that were an illustration of that. She always had told me that when she got caught, when she was in the truck, between the moment that she was arrested until the time that she went to this military place where they kept them until they were shipped to Poland. And she wrote a little note. She tore a little piece of paper and wrote a little note and threw it on the street, hoping that her parents would have it. And I used to say, yeah. And I never really believed it. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why I'm always so interested in watching movies about the Holocaust or reading books about the Holocaust is because even though my mother was there, I still can't believe it. So when she would tell me those stories, that I have believed it. And after she died, my cousin gave me my cousin, his mother, who was my mother's older sister, died also, and they left me a shoe box full of photos, and underneath the photo there was a thin envelope, and then I opened this envelope and I found the note that my mother had told me. I don't think even my mother knew that they had kept that note had arrived and she had kept it. And so as I reading that note, she said to her parents, please, her parents were quite old. She said, please take good care of yourself because I want to make sure that when I come back and I get married, you're in good shape. I don't know where I'm going, but I want you to know I'm leaving with a smile. So my hands were shaking when I was reading that note. I couldn't believe it. I was in the seaside. I was in the Bahamas. And I went into the water and I thought, that's who I am. I am the daughter of a woman who said that she left to the camps with a smile. Of course she didn't, but she said so. And the other sign that I have about her not wanting to be a victim is even more stronger than that. As I told you, when she was liberated, she weighed 49 pounds, so she could barely move. And so they had to fill a questionnaire to put their name, first name, state of health. And even though she could barely move, she wrote, excellent health. So this is how I grew up. I grew up with the torch of freedom in my hands. I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I was growing up, but I knew the kind of woman that I wanted to be. I wanted to be a woman who was independent, who was in charge of her life, and who could have a man's life in a woman's body. And I became that woman. I became that woman through a little dress. Quanto tempo? I don't have a time. Huh? No, because I don't have a timer, and as you see, these are my notes. So I became the woman I wanted to be through a little dress. I had, okay, I'm going to try to make it as fast as I can, tell you the story. Oh, it's a long story. You can buy my book. And if you buy it on iTunes, it's even my voice. Okay, so I went to, my mother wanted me to have a big life, so she exposed me to a lot of things very quickly. She sent me to boarding schools. I went to boarding school in England, in Switzerland, and I went to university, first in Spain and then in Switzerland. In Switzerland, I met my boyfriend. I had a boyfriend, and we fell in love. He was this charming prince. He was a prince. And he was half Italian and half Austrian, and we had a great time together. And then after 3 years, we separated, and he went to America to do a training in the bank, and I went to work first in Paris. I went to first to Paris. I became the secretary of a photographer's agent, Albert. Her granddaughter is here. Anyway, after I left there, I went to work for an Italian man who said, "Come to Italy, I will teach you the other side of fashion," because I had no idea about fashion at all. And when I worked with this photographer's agent, I learned about all of the different things about fashion. I learned about the magazines, the photographers, the makeup artists, the models, and all of that. And that was a whole new world for me. But when I met this Italian man, he took me to Italy, and he said, "Come and watch. He was a manufacturer. He had a printing plant. So he had a factory near Como where he used to print scarves, silk scarves for Gucci, Ferragamo, and people like that. So I sat there watching him. He was quite a bully, actually, screaming at his workers all the time. But he was very, very talented, and I learned a lot of things from him. From him, I learned how you buy an illustration, how you take an illustration, put it in repeat. I learned about color palettes. I learned about the different kind of printing. And it was actually very interesting because in Italy at that time, the workers, like the colorists, they were not just workers. I mean, they were artisans. Their parents were, their father was a colorist, and the grandfather was a colorist. So I was learning about all these crafts, and it was quite quite fascinating. He needed more space in his factory, and there was a factory next door that was available because they went out of business. And the reason they went out of business is because they used to make nylon stockings, and the pantyhose had just been created. So the people left, sold their factory with all these machines that were knitting hoses. And my friend Angelo, he was looking at these machines. He said, I don't really want to throw this machine. What could we do with this machine? And he called the yarn manufacturers, people like Dupont and Znia Viscosa, and he said, what if we try to knit, because it was knitting machine, they were like knitting machines. What if you put thicker yarns? What kind of product can we make? And so they did that, and that was actually the creator of the jersey fabric. So anyway, so the printing, the jersey, right? You following? Okay. Then, in order to, at the time, then he made, with this jersey, he would make little button shirts. And then he had the idea of doing printed T-shirts. Now, you have to understand that T-shirts now are so common, but T-shirt did not exist for women until the end of the 60s, I think. That was just a little bit before me. But just the end of the 60s, because T-shirts were actually men's underwear, and they were mostly worn for sailors. But in Saint-Tropez, France, south of France, Brigitte Bardot, there was a little boutique in Saint-Tropez on the port called Chose of Saint-Tropez. And they started to make colored T-shirts, red, blue, yellow, whatever. And it was written, there was a anchor drawn on it, and it said Saint-Tropez. And Brigitte Bardot, the famous French movie stars, used to wear these T-shirts. So all of a sudden, these colorful T-shirts were very much in fashion. So Angelo had the idea of printing the T-shirts. But then he needed to have a factory to actually sew these T-shirts. And because the fabric was so thin, he needed a special kind of very, very thin needles. So he bought another factory that had very thin needles, and I happened to be there at that time. Then my boyfriend came back, and we got together again, and my mother gave me for my birthday a trip to go to New York to visit him. So I came to New York to visit Egon, and then I fell in love. I fell in love with America. I fell in love with New York. Everything was so easy. Everything was, I don't know, it just seemed so, there was no classes in America, or at least it felt like it. Everybody called themselves, it was just, and New York at the time was very cheap because it was very dangerous, and therefore, when it's cheap and dangerous, you have a lot of artists, and therefore it was really fun. So I thought, and because I was the girlfriend of this very charming aristocrat who got invited everywhere, the young designers of New York were inviting me to their showroom so that I would wear their clothes. And that's how I met people like Holston and Giorgio Santangelo and Stephen Borrow and things like that. And they were making clothes that were very different than anything we had in Europe. So I was very excited. After a month, I had to go back to Europe. I went back to Europe, and my biggest dream was, how do I come back to America? I had to find a way to come back to America. And when I went to the factory, when I came back and went to the factories after my stay in New York, all of a sudden I saw printing, jersey, dresses, and somehow all together an idea started to formulate, And I said, I'm going to try to make a few samples and sell them in America. So at first I did it very hidden, I would stay late at night and work with a pattern maker, and I would take some fabrics that was on the floor that nobody was using, and I started to make my own few samples. Then Egon stopping in Italy because he was going on a trip with a friend of his around Asia, and he stopped by in Rome, and we met in Rome, and he said, tonight we're going to have a big party in a restaurant, and I invited all our friends, and I said, great. So he took me shopping, and he bought me a beautiful jumpsuit, and then we went to that dinner in that restaurant, and then he gave me a ring. And so it was kind of an engagement ring, although I didn't totally believe it, but it was a ring. And he said, I really love you, blah, blah, blah. And then he went off, right? He went off to India. And I went back to the factory, and then we were going from factories to factory with Angelo Ferretti, who had a yellow Maserati. And like every Italian man, he drove like a maniac. And one day we were going from Florence to Milan, and I arrived in Milan, and I felt so dizzy, and I felt so bad. I fainted in the street, and I thought it was the Maserati, but actually I was pregnant. So this was a big setback for me, because what I wanted more than anything was to be independent, and here I was pregnant with the best catch in Europe, and no one was going to believe it that I didn't do it on purpose. So anyway, so I went to Geneva to see my mother. What do? I can't do this. I don't want to tell him, and blah, blah, blah. And my mother said, no, you have to tell him. I mean, he gave you a ring. You are engaged. Whatever decision you make, it has to be the decision that you both made. So I wrote a telegram. You guys know what a telegram is? I wrote a telegram, trying to draft in code what had happened to me. And I got a telegram back 2 days later saying, don't worry about it, organized wedding mid-July in Paris. So at first I thought, how dare he just make these just say that by himself? And so my mother said, you're crazy. She left the house. By the time she came back, I was happy and on the way to organize the 10 minuti. So I was happy, and I went to Angelo Ferretti and I said, listen, I am pregnant, I'm getting married, and I'm moving to America. So can you please allow me to make samples, and I will try to sell it in America? And he did. And and I came to America. I got married. I went back to the factory, made my samples, joined Egon in New York, and that was, usually when you marry the prince in the fairy tale, your fairy tale ends. For me, it was the beginning of my fairy tale. So I just had a sign. I only have 5 minutes left. So I was very lucky. I did not know what I was doing. I did not know anything about the fashion business. But I was lucky. I was introduced to Diane von Furstenberg, who was the editor-in-chief of Vogue. And I was so intimidated. I went there. Oh, by the way, I had 2 children in 18 months. 13 months, 2 children. And so I came in with my suitcase, and I showed her the clothes. And until then, I had showed these little dresses to a lot of people, and nobody really understood. They said, no, this is boutique clothes. We can never sell that. And Diane von Furstenberg said, oh, it's genius. And then before I knew, I was out there in the street, and outside her office. Anyway, but her assistant was very helpful. I said, what do I do? Well, she said, well, what should do is you should take a room in a hotel, list yourself in the fashion calendar, and take a little picture, take an announcement in Women's Wear Daily. And I said, can I use your phone? And she said, yes. And I used her phone, and I did it. And that was 1972. I mean, after that, everything went so fast, and I really, really lived an American dream. By 1976, I was making 25,000 dresses a week. That's 50,000 sleeves. And I was on the cover of Newsweek, and I was on the cover of the Wall Street Journal. I have to tell you quickly the story of the Wall Street Journal. And what? Don't stop. Oh, yeah, no. I could be here until tomorrow morning. Anyway, so, all right. So one day I had 2 children. I separated. We stayed very good friends, but we separated very early. But I had 2 children at home, and so I used to stay, I had to travel a lot to promote my clothes, but I used to take very early planes in the morning so I could have dinner with my children at night. And so that one day I'm flying to Pittsburgh in a very early flight, and I am the only woman in the plane. And I have all this newspaper that I bought at the newsstand, magazines and newspaper, and on top of it was the Wall Street Journal because I happened to be on the front page. So, and so there's this guy sitting next to me, and he looks at my legs, and you know, he kind of is trying to start a conversation, but doesn't quite know how to start. And then he looks at me and he says, "Why does a girl like you read the Wall Street Journal?" And I looked at him and I thought, jerk. But I didn't say anything. I think I talked to him, but I never told him, here, I am on the front page. And the reason I didn't tell him, because it was such a huge satisfaction for me not to tell him. But of course, almost every time I make a speaking engagement, I tell that story. So I lived an American dream very early. I was 28 years old by the time I was on the cover. And so then, of course, I had been so successful so fast that, you know, usually people used to say that if you're on the front page and the cover of Newsweek or Time, you know, it's the kiss of death. Well, indeed it was, because what happens is that you get so overexposed, and then, you know, from overexposed, my manufacturer wanted to make only wrap dresses, and so from one day to the next, I had $4 million worth of inventory, and I was stuck. And anyway, it was my first big problem. But I cannot go through the whole story. I really can't. Because there's so many ups and so many downs and that's why I wrote this book, The Woman I Wanted to Be. And, but my journey has been so, and then I started a cosmetic line, which was a big success, and then I also had my problems then. Then I sold the whole thing in 1984, and after I sold everything, my children by then were teenagers, and when children are teenagers, you love them, but you don't like them, and they don't like you either. So they went to boarding school, and I moved to Paris. And I moved to Paris, and there I fulfilled another fantasy. I had always dreamt to have a literary salon, so I was living with a writer, and I started a small publishing house, and it was very fun. I met a lot of writers. I had a good time. And 5 years later, I was I missed the children, and I missed America, and I missed I don't know, and the affair wasn't going so well. So I came back to America, And those were actually the years I came back to America, the 1989, the early 90s, were probably the hardest time because my company, my brand, at the time you didn't even call it the brand, but my name was completely worthless. I mean, all the different companies that had it in different products, it was all in discount stores. It was really bad. I tried to meet with the people and tried to tell them what to do, but they didn't want to hear from me, and I really felt like a has-been. And it was really, really, I had some quite difficult years. As a matter of fact, I got a cancer at that time. I got a cancer at the base of the tongue. And I think it is because I couldn't express myself. But anyway, so, not that I want to brush it like that, but there's other things that happen after that. Then I started again. I mean, I will not tell you all the details, but I started again in the 90s, late 90s, because I saw that the young girls were buying the young hip girls were buying the old dresses in vintage shops. And I thought, wow, I couldn't believe that. And they thought it was so hip. Because in between my dresses originally and then we had lived through the 80s and Dynasty and what's the other one? Dallas. And with the big shoulder pads and the hair and the wrap dress didn't fit in there at all. So anyway, so I started again in the late 90s, and by then I was 50. I turned 50, and I took a little carriage house in the West Village in this neighborhood that nobody wanted to hear about, that smelled bad, that had all the butchers. And we started again and made a big success again, changed the neighborhood, we made the High Line, and now this neighborhood is a very good neighborhood. So anyway, so the story is like, life is a journey, and my journey was very full of different landscapes, different weather, mountains, colorful, boring, everything, but it has been a really wonderful life. So my life now, where am I now? I just turned 70, and I prepared myself for 1 full year about being prepared to turn 70, and now that I tell every single person I meet, because I rather tell them than watching, going on Google, and and also because I realized that, the wonderful thing about aging is that you have accumulated so many experiences, and you have so much and so much to share. So I always thought that a life of a woman, I guess a man too, but I'm not a man, so it can be divided in 3 stages. The first, which I will say is until 35, although as I grew older, I pushed it back a little. But the first is, I think, the stage that I call development, right? It's the moment that you have all the doors in front of you and which doors you push, and you're not quite sure which door is going to be your door, and that's the development. Then you have the middle years, like the 40s and the 50s, which is about enjoyment. And my advice for those years is try to find something that you stand for, that you become mythical for, even if it's just make the best apricot jam. And then comes the last period, which I think I call fulfillment, because your children have become parents. As a matter of fact, my 2 granddaughters are going to college next year, and and it's so, everybody say, oh, it's wonderful to have grandchildren, and it is wonderful, and I'm very close. But the best thing about having grandchildren is listening to your children saying the things that you never thought they heard. And so as I am, as I have now put my brand in the hands of a very talented English designer who is the new Chief Creative Officer, and as I'm detaching myself a little bit from the brand, I was thinking, what am I going to do? How can I age and be and stay relevant? So the things that I do, and the things that I want to do more and more, I am very committed to empowerment of women, and we have the DVF Awards and Vital Voices, and I'm on a lot of boards, and I'm going to continue, obviously, to do that. But what I think that what I want to do the most, and you see, when you are successful, two things happen, is one, you can pay your bills, and two, you have a voice. And when you have a voice, it's a duty, but it's really mostly a privilege to use your voice and the voice of other people that you know who have a voice, and to take these voices and weave them into a fabric of impact to help people who have no voice. So, and then I do a lot of mentoring. I go and talk to a lot of people, and I try to make them smile and laugh and sometimes cry. But more important than anything is, I think that and there is no boring story. Every person, every woman is a novel. But the only thing that is important is to speak the truth. And if you do speak the truth, and if you are really honest about not only your successes but your failure, then the chance is that you will inspire people. And every single person that you inspire is a dynasty behind. And the other things that I do want to say is that I have never met a woman who is not strong. All women are strong. But often, sometimes it's a brother or a husband or a religion, but mostly in our countries is the woman doesn't want to show her strength because we like to make the man feel strong, because we like to be. But the truth is that if there is a tragedy, it's always the woman who takes over and saves. So what I ask is, please know that you are strong before the tragedy. And if you know that you are strong, you don't even need to show it. Thank you.